The morning sun stretched long fingers across the dusty main street of Willow Creek, casting shadows that danced between the weathered buildings. Thomas Mitchell adjusted his worn hat and squinted at the crowd gathering around the auction platform. At 32, he had spent most of his adult life alone on his ranch, tending cattle and watching seasons change with only his horse, Blue, for company. The autumn air carried the scent of dried leaves and distant wood smoke. Thomas had ridden into town for supplies, nothing more. But the unusual commotion in the town square had drawn him like a moth to flame. Townsfolk whispered in hushed tones, their faces a mixture of curiosity and something that looked like fear. "What's all the fuss about, Martha?" Thomas asked the baker's wife, who stood wringing her hands near the platform. Martha Jenkins turned to him with wide eyes. "Oh, Thomas, it's the most peculiar thing. That traveling merchant, Mr. Blackwood, he's got himself a bride to auction off. Says she's been cursed or some such nonsense." Thomas frowned, his weathered hands tightening around Blue's reins. "A bride auction? That doesn't sit right with me, Martha." "Nor with most folks here," Martha replied, lowering her voice, "but she's single quotes s. Different, Thomas, real different. Taller than any woman I've ever seen, and she's got this burlap sack over her head. Won't speak a word, just stands there like a statue." The rancher's gaze moved to the platform where a figure in a simple brown dress stood perfectly still. Even from this distance, he could see that Martha spoke the truth. The woman towered over Mr. Blackwood, who was a man of average height himself. The rough burlap sack completely covered her head and face, tied loosely around her neck. "Poor soul," Thomas murmured, feeling something twist in his chest. "How'd she end up in such a state?" Martha shrugged. "Blackwood claims he won her in a card game from some mountain folk. Says she's been cursed to remain silent and hidden until someone shows her true kindness. Sounds like fairy tale nonsense." To me, the merchant's voice boomed across the square. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you a most unusual bride. Strong as an ox, tall as a tree, and quiet as a mouse. She work hard and never complain. The bidding starts at $5. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Several men laughed nervously, but no one raised a hand. Thomas watched the woman's shoulders, the only part of her he could read, and noticed the slight tremor that ran through them. She was afraid. $4, Blackwood called out, desperation creeping into his voice. Still silence from the crowd. The woman's hands, Thomas noticed, were clasped tightly in front of her. Her fingernails were clean, her posture straight despite everything. There was dignity in the way she carried herself, even in this humiliating situation. $3. Surely someone needs a strong wife. Thomas felt his jaw clench. This was wrong, all of it. No woman should be treated like livestock, cursed or not. He thought of his empty ranch house, the silence that greeted him each evening, the meals he ate alone by lamplight. $2. My final offer before I take her to the next town. Something inside, Thomas snapped. Not anger, exactly, but a deep certainty that he couldn't walk away from this. He raised his hand before he could think better of it. $2, he called out, his voice steady and clear. The crowd turned to stare at him. Some faces showed surprise, others pity. Martha Jenkins shook her head slowly, as if he'd just volunteered to walk into a burning building. "Sold," Blackwood exclaimed with obvious relief. To the gentleman in the blue shirt, Thomas dismounted and walked to the platform, pulling 2 crumpled dollar bills from his pocket. The woman hadn't moved, hadn't acknowledged the transaction. That had just changed both their lives. "She's all yours," Mr. Blackwood said, pocketing the money quickly. "Good luck to you both." The merchant disappeared into the crowd before Thomas could ask any questions. The rancher found himself standing alone with his unusual purchase, uncertain of what to do next. "Ma'am," he said softly, "my name is Thomas Mitchell. I have a ranch about 5 miles outside town. Would you like to come with me?" She nodded once, a barely perceptible movement. The ride to the ranch passed in complete silence. The woman sat sideways on Blue, her long legs making the arrangement awkward but manageable. Thomas walked alongside, leading the horse and stealing glances at his mysterious companion. Up close, he could see that her dress, though simple, was well made. Her hands were strong but feminine, with calluses that spoke of honest work. The ranch house sat in a small valley, surrounded by rolling hills, dotted with oak trees. It was a modest place, built by Thomas's father 30 years ago, with a wide porch and windows that caught the morning light. Thomas had always been proud of it, but now he saw it through different eyes. Would she think it too small? Too isolated? "This is home," he said as they approached. "It's not much, but it's clean and warm." She nodded again. Thomas helped her down from the horse, noticing how carefully she moved, how she seemed to take up space apologetically. In the golden light of late afternoon, he could see the gentle curve of her shoulders, the graceful way she held her head, despite the crude sack. "Are you hungry?" he asked. "I was about to start supper." Another nod. They sat across from each other, at the small kitchen table, eating beans and cornbread by lamplight. The woman lifted the bottom edge of the sack just enough to bring food to her mouth, her movements careful and practiced. Thomas pretended not to watch, focusing on his own meal and the comfortable sounds of evening settling around them. Days passed in this quiet rhythm. She helped with the chores without being asked, her strength proving to be every bit as impressive as Blackwood had claimed. She could lift feed sacks that Thomas struggled with, mend fences with skill that matched his own, and somehow managed to calm even his most skittish cattle with her presence. In the evenings, they sat on the porch listening to crickets and watching stars appear in the darkening sky. Thomas found himself talking to her about his day, his hopes for the spring planting, memories of his parents. She listened with what felt like genuine interest, occasionally nodding or tilting her head in a way that encouraged him to continue. It was on the 7th evening that Thomas realized he was falling in love with this mysterious woman, not with her appearance, which remained hidden, but with her gentle presence, her quiet strength, and the way she seemed to bring peace to his previously lonely home. "I need to tell you something," he said as they sat watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. "I don't care about any curse, or what you might look like under that sack. You've brought more joy to this place in a week than I've known in years. If you're willing, I'd like to marry you. Properly, I mean, with a preacher and everything." She turned toward him then, and even through the rough burlap, he could feel the intensity of her gaze. "Thomas," she said, and her voice was like honey in sunshine, warm and sweet and absolutely perfect. "Thomas Mitchell." The moment she spoke his name, something remarkable happened. The sack seemed to dissolve, not torn or removed, but simply vanishing like morning mist. And there, in the golden light of sunset, sat the most beautiful woman Thomas had ever seen. She wasn't a giant at all. He realized she was tall, yes, but perfectly proportioned. Her hair fell in waves of auburn around her shoulders. Her eyes were the deep green of summer grass, and her smile held all the warmth that had been hidden for so long. "My name is Catherine," she said, reaching for his hand. "And yes, Thomas Mitchell, I would very much like to marry you." Later, as they sat together under the stars, Catherine explained that she had indeed been cursed by a bitter old woman in the mountains. The curse could only be broken by someone who would offer marriage without seeing her face. Someone who would love her for who she was rather than how she looked. "I was beginning to think it would never happen," she admitted, her head resting on Thomas's shoulder. "But then you came along, with your kind heart and your gentle ways." Thomas smiled, thinking of the $2 that had bought him, not a bride, but a love story that would last a lifetime. In the distance, an owl called to its mate, and the sound seemed to bless their newfound happiness. The next morning, the preacher from Willow Creek rode out to the ranch, and Thomas Mitchell married Catherine in a simple ceremony under the old oak tree by the creek. The whole town came to celebrate, including Martha Jenkins, who cried happy tears and claimed she'd known all along that things would work out just fine. And they did work out fine. For many years to come, in the little ranch house in the valley, where love had conquered both loneliness and curses with nothing more than $2 and a good man's kind heart.